Oregon was wheeled out of the ICU at Ben Taub Hospital, his body wired with electrodes and his mother at his side. He had arrived at the ER 6 days earlier, complaining of confusion, stomach pain, and shortness of breath. The ER physicians drained nearly half a gallon of fluid from around his right lung, corrected the sodium imbalances that contributed to his confusion, and relieved the worst of his pain. Still, every part of his body was a vivid yellow. A calculation made using his blood work showed that, unless he received a liver transplant, he had only an 18% chance of surviving the next 90 days. Like most safety net systems, Harris Health does not cover organ transplants. This may be why, when Dr. Ricardo Niula's team took over Mr. Oregon's case, they fixated on the tube in Mr. Oregon's nose, and the team geared their treatment plan towards helping him die comfortably. But when they explained their plan to Mr. Oregon and his mother, she put a stop to the conversation. Her son was only 36 years old, much too young to die, so the team went to work on his breathlessness. Then, a medical student noted something in Mr. Oregon's history that the rest of the team had missed. He used to have Medicaid. How, they wondered, did Mr. Oregon qualify for Medicaid, and could he qualify again, putting a transplant within reach? Dr. Niula tells the story of his encounter with Mr. Oregon in an article in The New Yorker. Dr. Niula and his team discovered that caring for Mr. Oregon well involved becoming curious about his social circumstances. I'll be talking about social determinants of health, including the importance of asking questions about your patient's social circumstances while avoiding stereotyping, taking steps to mitigate stereotype threat, understanding the impact of adverse childhood experiences, working with your team to address needs, and advocating for your patients. At this point in your career, you've probably heard a lot about social determinants of health, defined by the World Health Organization as the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping conditions of daily life. Maybe you've come across statistics like this. If you're born in the Nevers neighborhood in New Orleans, your life expectancy at birth is 80 years. If you're born in the Iberville neighborhood, it's 55 years. U.S. non-Hispanic white mothers die in childbirth at the rate of 12.7 per 100,000 live births. For African American mothers, it's 43.5. If you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, like experiencing physical or emotional abuse, being in a home where there's domestic violence, or having a parent incarcerated, your relative risk of COPD is 2.5 times that of someone with 0 ACEs, and your risk for suicidality is 12 times greater. Communication about social determinants, including these statistics, can send a message that all people in a group are the same. But I've discovered it's different for every patient, and lumping all people with one characteristic in common together on the basis of that characteristic, in effect stereotyping, can be very damaging. Dr. Niula's team started out stereotyping Mr. Oregon. He was Hispanic and therefore undocumented and unfundable. Those assumptions were mistaken. I've learned that there's no substitute for asking questions if you want to understand the challenges that face a particular patient and the social factors that may be contributing to that patient's health problems. Everything from mold in an apartment to a recent loss of a job or repossession of a car, to a lifetime of exposure to homophobia or interpersonal and structural racism. Factors that are a frequent challenge for the patients I see include lacking reliable transportation to and from appointments, difficulty finding childcare, inflexible or unpredictable work hours, a dilemma for hourly workers in particular, choosing between paying for prescriptions or paying for food, utilities, and rent, patient or caregiver struggles with untreated anxiety or depression and need for mental health services which are often difficult to access, and, for patients who are native speakers of languages other than English, language barriers. I'm often quick to label patients or their caregivers non-compliant, only to discover later that a lack of resources or other challenges made them non-able to comply. I've kicked myself for not asking more questions up front. So why don't I, and lots of my colleagues, ask? Well, first, we may worry about being intrusive or stereotyping. It's important to ask about social determinants consistently for all patients and note that it's standard practice. We can also take steps to minimize the risk of stereotype threat, which people experience when they are afraid of confirming a negative stereotype associated with their race, gender, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, or other social identity. This fear induces arousal and anxiety, which impair cognitive performance and can also trigger confrontational behavior or defensiveness, all of which can end up reinforcing stereotypes. One group of experts has suggested reducing the impact of stereotype threat by providing clues that challenge negative stereotypes, such as using photos that counter stereotypes in posters and educational materials, expressing commitments to caring, fairness, non-discrimination, and ensuring that the messaging extends to non-physician staff. Attempts to discuss issues of obesity, diet, alcohol, and smoking in particular may arouse suspicions of ethnic stereotyping, so try positive framing such as, "I set a high bar for my patients because I want them to enjoy the best health possible. Our conversations have convinced me that you're up to the challenge of making changes." If a patient has difficulty, you can normalize difficulty as common and then express personal interest in building confidence by asking how the patient has overcome challenges in the past. Second, we may be afraid of opening up a can of worms, finding out about needs we can't address. The statistics that grab our attention can also be daunting. At the end, I'll provide some reference tools you can use as is or modify to reflect the resources available in your setting. It helps that asking about a patient's social situation is also a way to find out about sources of resilience and hope. In Mr. Oregon's case, his mother's fierce determination and the hint that there might be a pathway to the treatment he needed through a public insurance program. The same kind of worries about being too intrusive and engaging in stereotyping, and worries about not being equipped to respond, extend to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These stressors, which have pervasive effects on health through a variety of biological pathways, can manifest in apathy and withdrawal, or hypervigilance and flare-ups of anger. We may be quick to attribute these traits to character flaws or personality defects. They may instead signal untreated trauma. Too often, the message healthcare and other systems send to those affected is, "What's wrong with you?" rather than, "What happened to you?" It's important to consider the possibility of trauma as a factor in noncompliance or challenging inpatient encounters across patient populations and settings. The original ACE study population was majority white, middle class, and insured, and the study was launched because Dr. Vincent Felitti was trying to figure out why so many of his patients were dropping out of a weight loss program despite initial progress. He discovered that problems in childhood were highly correlated with a range of adult health issues and behaviors. There is currently a debate about whether universal screening for ACEs is desirable, but everyone should understand the value of trauma-informed care once a need coupled with a desire for help has been identified, and find out how to access it. If done well, that care can be effective in helping patients manage symptoms and tap into sources of resilience in order to heal. Maybe at this point you're thinking, "Okay, but I don't possess God-like authority." And that's true, but you do have the power to impact patient and family well-being in significant ways. I want to encourage you to take ownership and, at the very same time, recognize that healthcare is a team effort. Taking ownership means recognizing the power you do have, including the power to pose questions and listen attentively when patients trust you enough to supply honest answers that include information about their struggles and hopes. Recognizing healthcare as a team effort means that while you know broadly about whole-person care, social services, and ethics, you shouldn't hesitate to engage support from other professionals, including social workers, nurses, financial counselors, chaplains, and clinical ethicists, when their specialized expertise would benefit a patient or family. In particular, social workers wish physicians knew that their training and skill set includes providing therapeutic and emotional support and having an in-depth understanding of the social determinants of health. So learn about the channels within your institution for accessing support services and the resources available in the larger community. If you're lucky, Your institution will have a medical legal partnership that can address health-relevant legal needs like remediating poor housing conditions, appealing a denial or loss of benefits, securing specialized educational services, enforcing workplace rights, clearing a credit history, securing a restraining order for domestic violence, or assisting with an asylum application. Otherwise, your community should have a legal services organization with a sliding scale to which you can make referrals for these kinds of services. If this information is hard to find, you could consider joining forces with colleagues to compile a resource directory. And remember, you are a role model for medical students and other trainees, like the medical student in the story whose discovery was welcomed by other members of the team. Perhaps you're curious about where that discovery led. When the team started digging, they learned that Mr. Oregon was a legal resident eligible for Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, one of the few bases for Medicaid for an adult in Texas. But there were further complexities. For example, even with his history of low-paying service jobs, Mr. Oregon's earnings resulted in SSDI payments that put him just over the Texas income threshold for Medicaid. Medicare on the basis of disability has a 24-month waiting period. Would the nearest transplant center consider performing the procedure as charity? Not without securing financing for his post-op care. Running out of options, the team called the representative for his congressional district, and a visit and some phone calls later, miraculously, Mr. Oregon was approved for Medicaid. But it was too late. An episode of bleeding in the brain rendered him unresponsive without prospect of recovery. A month to the day after Mr. Oregon came to the ER, his mother asked the team to remove her son from life support. Dr. Niula spoke at his wake and asked if it would be okay to share his experience. "Please do," said Mr. Oregon's mother. When Dr. Niula finished speaking, she asked him to pass along a message to the team. It was something that Mr. Oregon had told her towards the end. "I feel so important," he had said. "Everyone treats me like I'm rich." The team's efforts didn't save Mr. Oregon's life, but they did change his life. They also changed the team's experience of caring for him, and they made a difference to his mother, and likely affected how she and other members of the family will relate to the healthcare system. Finally, telling the story is part of Dr. Niula's effort to change the outcome for future patients and a reminder of the importance of advocacy for system change. Given evidence that increasing consultation time, just 2 to 3 minutes for complex cases, has been shown to improve coordinated care and patient enablement and decrease healthcare provider stress, maybe some of you will see an opening for advocacy on that front at your institution. Or you may want to get involved in legislative advocacy. For example, I know of a pediatric resident who wrote to state legislators to try to get them to change a state statutory rape law that discriminates against same-sex couples, harming his LGBT patients and violating his sense of professional obligation, since he was required to report and was so made complicit in the discrimination. I'll close with a quick recap. First, learn each patient's story. To quote Dr. Felitti, famous for the original ACE study, "Slowly, I have come to see that asking and listening and accepting are a profound form of doing." Second, approach patients with humility and consider how their individual experiences and past traumas may impact their interactions with you. Rather than getting frustrated, try to see the situation through their eyes. 3. Do some kind of screening for social determinants of health. The Center for Child Health Policy and Advocacy, a collaboration between Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine, recently published a report on social determinants of health screening in the clinical setting. The focus is on the pediatric setting, but several of the tools reviewed are intended for general use. Of note, most tools are available free of charge and take 5 minutes or less to administer. Also, the Center for Healthcare Strategies, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, has a web page with a brief on screening for social determinants of health and direct links to 5 screening tools. Fourth, be on the alert for and avoid stereotyping and take steps to counter stereotype threat in your practice. Fifth, take ownership, but also use your support network and contribute to efforts to ensure that you and your colleagues can readily identify and access resources to address social determinants of health. And sixth, Be an advocate for your patients and for system and social change when you see an unmet need or social injustice. In a Health Affairs article titled "The Voice on the Other End of the Phone," interpreter Natalie Kelly writes, "I've interpreted for patients who ask, 'Why is the doctor speaking so slowly to me? Does he think I'm stupid?' I've also interpreted the words, 'Please tell the nurse not to yell at me. I don't have a hearing problem. I just don't speak English.' Recently, I heard a physician say, in all seriousness, 'Next time you come, you speak Inglés, understand?' At this point in your career, you've probably heard a lot about cultural competency, described by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as the provision of culturally and linguistically appropriate services that are respectful of and responsive to the health beliefs, practices, and needs of diverse patients. HHS is responsible for enforcing laws prohibiting discrimination based on national origin and mandating the offer of language assistance services. Many experts prefer the term cultural humility because it suggests a commitment to self-evaluation and critique, includes an awareness of power imbalances in our relationships with patients and families, and incorporates efforts to partner with others to change those power imbalances within larger institutions and systems. In this module, after presentation of a brief profile of the Houston region, my focus will be on some relatively advanced skills like clearly communicating empathy in context complicated by cultural and linguistic differences, addressing disrespectful language or behavior on the part of colleagues, and becoming more expert in working with professional interpreters, whether in person, via video, or on the phone. Before we get there, I want to address the common criticism that cultural competency training is too generic. I'm going to share some information about the Houston region, and I encourage you to find similar data for any place you may practice in the future. In the past 3 decades, Houston has been transformed into one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse metropolitan areas in the U.S. In 1980, Hispanic people comprised 16% of the population. In 2018, Hispanic people made up 42% of the population. And Houston has welcomed about 30 of every 1,000 refugees the UN resettles anywhere in the world, more than any other U.S. city. Based on that track record, if Houston were a country, it would rank 4th in the world for refugee resettlement. Almost 1/2 of the population of Harris County speaks a language other than English at home, compared to 1/4 of the total U.S. population. So the time I'll devote to communication, including, at the end, working with interpreters, should have immediate relevance to your work. But first, empathetic communication. I started out thinking that being good with people is simply innate. You're either a people person and a good communicator, or you're not. I've discovered that effective empathetic communication with people who have different backgrounds involves a specific skill set that can be taught and practiced. Empathy isn't just feeling what someone else feels. It's trying to actively understand a person's feelings and perspective holistically, and then acting upon that knowledge to personalize care. It includes skillful use of limited time to elicit the patient's concerns and communicate that you care. One approach that is widely used is called the 4 habits and includes tips to improve any patient encounter. I'm going to focus on habit 1, invest in the beginning, and habit 3, demonstrate empathy, because in studies, researchers have found that these are the components that even experienced clinicians tend to omit in cross-cultural encounters. Invest in the beginning has 3 aspects: creating rapport quickly, eliciting a patient's concerns, and planning the visit with the patient. At the outset, introduce yourself to everyone in the room. Acknowledge any wait. Convey knowledge of the patient's history by commenting on a prior visit or problem if possible. Show concern for the patient's comfort, and make social comment or ask a non-medical question to put the patient at ease. Then, in eliciting concerns, start with an open-ended question like, "What would you like help with today?" Or, "I understand that you're here for X. Could you tell me more about that?" If you start by identifying a single issue, after the patient finishes talking, follow up with, Is there anything else? One study found that patients were interrupted a mean of 18 seconds after beginning to speak. Once interrupted, only 1 of 51 patients introduced concerns later in the visit. Yet patients with multiple concerns do not necessarily present them in priority order, so any efficiency gain from cutting patients off comes at considerable cost. Finally, planning the visit involves repeating back concerns to check understanding, letting the patient know what to expect, and prioritizing concerns if necessary. After you elicit the patient's perspective, you have an opportunity to demonstrate empathy by being open to the patient's emotions, making at least one empathetic statement, conveying empathy non-verbally, and being aware of your own reactions. Be alert for changes in the patient's body language and voice tone that signal emotion, and present opportunities to deliver empathetic comments or gestures. For example, you can name a likely emotion as in, "That sounds really upsetting," or compliment a patient on her efforts to address a problem. Pausing to absorb information in a way that acknowledges its significance or leaning forward can convey attention and empathy non-verbally. Finally, your own emotional response can be a clue to what the patient might be feeling. There are 2 additional tips for empathetic communication that are especially relevant to limited English proficiency patients. These tips build on research identifying 2 major communication barriers that especially impact these groups. 1. Physicians' use of medical jargon, and 2. Patients' reluctance to ask questions for fear of being burdensome or seeming incompetent. To help address these barriers, use the simplest lay language possible to explain medical concepts and check patient and family comprehension. You can use nonverbal clues from patients and families, including facial expressions and evidence of emotional states, to ascertain if they understand the information or if more clarification is needed. Put the onus for achieving comprehension on yourself, not on them. Suggestions for framing include, "It's my job to explain this in a way that makes sense to you. It would help me if you would share what you understand." Or, "I've gone over a lot of information and I want to make sure that I've been communicating well. Can you go over what I said in your own words?" Okay, so you're not in the habit of making offensive statements, and you're pretty good at empathetic communication and getting better, but maybe your coworkers aren't as enlightened. You might worry that confronting negative attitudes or behavior towards patients and family members based on race, national origin, or language involves taking on the role of the moral police, and that's not a role you signed up for or know how to carry out without harming your relationships with coworkers. My message? Taking responsibility for your coworkers' professional behavior is part of your job as a physician, and you can do it in a way that is respectful rather than sanctimonious, and in many cases, relationship building. Consider insensitive comments or comments that reflect negative racial and ethnic stereotypes. If a coworker refers to Hispanic panic, parrots some other stereotype, or otherwise acts in a dismissive or disrespectful manner, whether in the presence of a patient or not, what kind of interventions are possible and likely to promote behavior change? There's a concept called fool's choice. Basically, when we consider taking action, we tend to devolve into binary thinking, assuming we can either be honest or respectful. By observing 2 principles, you can be both. First, make it safe. Being told that something you said or did was offensive is scary, and the natural response to scary things is defensiveness. To make it less scary for the other person to hear your message, a good place to start is by sharing your positive intent. That might include leading off with a statement that you are on the same team and you want to raise issues as they come up rather than letting them fester. An issue has come up and you'd like to discuss it, but you want them to understand it's a two-way street. If you say or do something the other person considers problematic, you hope they will do the same for you. Second, assume poor skill, not poor motive. Typically, when someone has behaved poorly, we assume it is because of poor motive. Step back from those judgments. Maybe they think this is okay. Maybe this is how they've built rapport with colleagues in the past. Maybe they've been at an institution where dismissive language towards certain patients or groups was part of the hidden curriculum. Is it possible that no one has ever been courageous and kind enough to give them feedback about their behavior? Stepping back from judgment creates space to engage your coworker in authentic dialogue. In other words, empathy also has a place in these challenging conversations. Finally, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about working with professional interpreters. I've been there, watching the clock, waiting for someone to arrive, and forming the thought that calling a professional interpreter is a hassle to be avoided at all costs. I've been tempted to rely on an ad hoc interpreter or my own Spanish, but then I remember all the downsides of relying on ad hoc interpreters, the potential for everything from privacy violations to medical errors to psychological harm to the person being pulled into a role that they have not been prepared for. And I remember that medical Spanish is different from middle school Spanish and that there are many dialects. Further, clinicians have a tendency to overestimate their language proficiency. In fact, Glenn Flores and colleagues found that 42% of false fluency errors committed by clinicians occur in the presence of an interpreter and go uncorrected. Apparently, it's hard for professional interpreters to tell clinicians they're making mistakes. Imagine how hard it is for patients and families to bring problems to the attention of the clinician. Fortunately, there are several specific steps you can take to reduce the hassle factor in working with a professional interpreter and to collaborate with interpreters in ways that strengthen therapeutic relationships. Some tips. Know the number for the unit of your institution that is responsible for language services and get to know the people there. If a patient is coming in for whom you know language services will be required, call ahead. For example, at Texas Children's Hospital, many clinics have dedicated Spanish interpreters and other interpreters pre-scheduled for specific languages. Frustration about what happens after the interpreter arrives is also common. Aren't visits that require interpretation a time sink? 2 studies found that many physicians perceive visits with non-English speaking patients to be more time-consuming than visits with English-speaking patients. Both studies then measured actual visit time, and both found no difference overall between visit times for the 2 types of patients. Remember that body language gives you an additional mode of communication, so keep eye contact and look for opportunities to act out your questions. For instance, instead of asking, "Any belly pain?" you might ask, "Do you have any belly pain here?" while pointing at the epigastric area. You may wonder when it's best to use an in-person interpreter versus a phone interpreter, if you have both options. Phone interpreters are helpful for basic services, especially for rarely encountered languages, and scenarios where patients want to avoid involving an interpreter who might know them. You should remember to take extra care and time in describing the need and process for phone interpretation for patients who are fearful of the police or government. Remember, they don't know who is on the other end of the line. Extra care is also indicated for mental health patients who might have trouble trusting a disembodied voice. Some institutions have interpreters on wheels, involving the use of a tablet to video conference with an interpreter as an alternative to phone interpretation, which could be especially helpful in these cases. Finally, phone interpretation is generally not suitable for communication of bad prognoses, as a phone interpreter can read voice tone and few other signals, but cannot pick up on body language. There's currently controversy over whether an interpreter should strive to be a self-effacing conduit for the clinician's communication or a contributor to empathetic communication. Of course, as a clinician, you'll always speak directly to the patient or family member, but should the professional interpreter's aim be conveying whatever you say within absolute fidelity and apart from that, invisibility, as most current guidelines suggest, or cultural mediation? Much recent research shows that many professional interpreters see themselves as cultural mediators and agents of empathy. For example, they may try to soften statements that could sound harsh or impolite in cultural context, or introduce culturally appropriate terms like diminutives for child patients that convey caring. Physicians are mixed on this. Some have said they like it when interpreters engage in cultural mediation, while others have said they think interpreters are introducing bias or error and stepping on physicians' toes by doing this kind of work. More research needs to be done on this front, but physicians should at least recognize interpreters as professionals and members of the team, communicating their expectations in advance, and creating opportunities after visits for interpreters to share any issues they've noticed. To conclude with a recap. First, like any skill, empathetic communication and cross-cultural mediation encounters, really any medical encounter, can be cultivated and improved through practice. As Doctors Melanie Turvalon and Jan Murray Garcia note, patient-focused communication consistent with cultural humility creates an atmosphere that enables the patient's telling of his or her own illness or wellness story, removing the need for complete mastery of every group's health beliefs and other concerns because the patient is encouraged to share how much or little culture has to do with any particular clinical encounter. Second, walking the talk of cultural competency or cultural humility sometimes involves seeking out coworkers for uncomfortable conversations. Fortunately, it's possible to speak up to address negative language and behavior in ways that are not arrogant or relationship-destroying. Skillful, empathetic communication is key here. Finally, there are specific steps you can take to minimize the frustrations of enlisting the help of a professional interpreter and maximize the likelihood that the interpreter's involvement will be an asset that enhances your relationships with the patients and their families, protects against misunderstandings, and improves health outcomes.